cheap solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles are changing the transport and energy sector as we know. I bring in guests to this podcast who will help you with their ideas to navigate this energy transition. By the way, this episode is also available as a video on our YouTube channel. Just search Energypreneurs. Thank you for joining. Gentlemen, good afternoon from Manila. I'm very excited. We hear all sorts of things, V2L, V2G. So I thought it would be a good idea to get good understanding of what these technologies are, what it means, what can it benefit for me as an individual customer, maybe as a utility or even a country. So maybe we can start sort of introduction. Ricardo, you want to start? Just introduce yourself, who you are, and then we go from there.
Yeah, I'm Ricardo Pedorella, 17 years in e-mobility, a little bit less in DER. I work in the development of vehicles, charging infrastructure, protocols. I'm currently the Open Charge Alliance's OCPP ambassador for Asia and Oceania, and I've contributed to a range of other standards and applications, research, and productization in this space.
Thank you. Peter, want to go ahead next?
Yes, I'm Peter Kilby from Energy Queensland. My background is in distribution networks. I've been working on DER integration, particularly focused on rooftop PV for the last decade. And in recent years, supporting the development of 4777 to ensure that we have a relatively technology agnostic approach to supporting a range of based generation, including PV and these.
Okay, thank you. Ross?
Thanks, Dave. It's Ross Durango. Until recently, I headed up energy and infrastructure at the Electric Vehicle Council. Prior to that, I was 13 years at NHP. I've been doing EV-related stuff at the intersection of EVs and energy for almost 10 years now. I get involved in things like the wiring rules, AS3000, building code, national construction code, consumer protection considerations as to how we're going to move a future where the vast majority of things on our roads are powered by batteries rather than petrol and diesel.
Wonderful. Okay, Anthony.
Thanks for having us on too. So Anthony Seipold, unlike the sort of the experts here, my focus is more on energy policy and regulation. And so my specific technical knowledge is much lacking compared to the rest of this group, but I have a real focus in CER, DER, how it can benefit consumers and how we can make it work within the grid in the future as we exponentially increase the amount of it connecting.
Thank you. And Dave?
Yeah, so I work in market design for wholesale electricity markets. So my interest is on the G end of the V2G. I'm interested in the battery. I don't much care about the wheels. I'd be just as interested if it was a big battery stuck on a heap of bricks. Obviously they're not, and that's what makes it so exciting, this sort of synergy between the two.
Yeah. And you all also have a common thread. You all have been kind enough to be a guest on my podcast, and I will provide those links for if people want to dig down a bit more on what your thinkings are for the EV. Now, can we start with the definition? What is V2G or LH? Can somebody start with that definition and then explain the technology in basic? Who wants to go?
I can let you crack at it first, and then the rest of the crew can tear it apart and tell me where I got it wrong.
Yeah.
I was hoping someone like Ricardo might jump in here with someone technical.
So I'll start with the easiest one. V2L is essentially where your vehicle provides something like a power point that you can plug things into. Really handy if you're going camping, handy if your house has a power outage and you want to run a fridge or a freezer or charge your phone. Not so much on the G end that Dave's interested in, but from the utility to the consumer point of view, the ability to be able to drive the car somewhere and then run tools or appliances is useful. The next one you mentioned is V2H. Now, there's a whole spread of ways that V2H can be enabled and lots of tricky technical stuff under the hood as to what we mean when we distinguish V2L and V2G and V2H. But in broad strokes, V2H is the idea that the energy comes out of your vehicle and runs you to home without going past your home and then out into the grid. I'm not going to dive into the technical weeds right now during the explanation as to what that means, but that's your broad strokes of V2H. V2G is when the energy comes out of the vehicle into your home or other building structure, which is housing the electrical infrastructure, and then out into the wider grid for someone else to use. So it could be as simple as it exports from your garage through your switchboard, and your neighbor 3 doors down sucks that down to power their air conditioner. Or it could be at a much, much larger scale if we're talking about millions of these vehicles exporting at the same time, replicating the function of a Hazelwood or an Herring distributed around our community. Here's my quick elevator pitch. How'd I go, guys? Who wants to jump in and say, nah, Ross got it wrong here and here?
And in terms of that technology, of course, there are a lot of details there, whether it's a AC and DC and other handshaking. Ricardo, you want to maybe add a bit on that without getting into too much?
Yeah, look, the only thing I'd add is that of those three, which get thrown around in the market, V2G is a standardized definition. In any technical standard, no. Where it's simply been grid synchronized bidirectional power transfer from an EV. So it comes out of an EV, it's the grid. V2H, there are some internet commentators that want to have their right to define what V2H is written on their tombstones as their life achievements. Some believe it's netted by an energy meter in a home or a dwelling or a premises. Some believe it's V2L into a switchboard. What we have as V2L, convenience power, is not a standardized function. So you can't say what is, from a V2L perspective, how is it provided AC, DC, at what level of power quality, with what resilience, with what power factor supported. Doesn't exist. But in terms of V2G, that's the normative one that matters. Whether it's AC, whether it's DC, whether it's provided wireless or wirelessly, is a function of standards that are concordant to the development of vehicle charging along the way. So yes, AC is supported, yes, DC is supported, yes, set point control is supported, big banging PQ type commands are supported. There are many possibilities to how it's implemented. I think we get wrapped up in AC and DC as the two major discriminants. There are actually many. A car can be standardized in its application to do as much, but differ in how it does. So there's a fair bit to learn and diffuse in the market, but primarily V2G is grid synchronized bidirectional power transfer. That's it.
So if I'm a consumer, from my perspective, as Ross mentioned, it's very simple to understand. I have a tool, I just connect my car. So it's a big battery. And then you say, oh, okay, it would be nice to connect my house to it. Then, of course, there's a ramification suddenly for the utilities, because I may not be taking that much electricity at that time from the grid. And so what are the immediate benefit that the consumers can see from connecting their car to their house or a load? Peter, you are a power utility person, right? You want to tell us a bit more? What's the thinking? What can the consumer benefit, or anyone wants to pick up?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best person to reflect the consumer's view, but we're all consumers here ultimately. So I'm quite keen to have a go. I think the clear benefits that customers are already keen on to grid on vehicle to home for is to avoid, or I guess maximize their own self-consumption of their solar, and also avoid those higher costs that often people face for consuming power in the evening peaks. So there's these two different segments that we've got: consumers that are really focused on self-consuming and maximizing their own solar use. And then there's the other customers that are excited about the opportunity of participating in the market more actively with some of the wholesale exposed tariffs like Amber and local vaults. Domestic customers can take advantage of a higher feed-in tariffs than we've traditionally seen for solar, with rates of $10 or even nearly $20 a kilowatt hour offered on those really extreme hot summer nights and cold winter nights, as we've seen recently. So there's quite distinct segments there. And then just building briefly on what Ricardo was saying, whenever you synchronize with the Australian standard 4777 applies, just as it applies to the battery systems. Whereas if you're doing that separated connection, an alternative supply, if you will, those systems don't have as many requirements in terms of what the inverters need. And then the final point, while I'm on the standards, is that DCA distinction. We see most of the products that are on the verge of coming to market now are really the DC, and that's because the grid compliance is probably easier when all of those requirements in the box on the wall. And we're probably still a couple of years away from the AC solution, which have some appeal in terms of lowering the cost of the charging station infrastructure, but face some interoperability challenges at the moment in terms of the wall box communicating the local grid requirements to the inverter, which is now within the vehicle. And I don't think I did a very good job of representing the customer there. Hopefully, I think there's a few people on here that can do a better job.
Yeah, we are all customers. Just one thing I want to pick up on what you mentioned. The vehicle to connecting the car to my house will give me benefit whether I have rooftop solar or not. It will, because it's not a prerequisite. Of course, if you have a solar, you can optimize and maximize the benefit.
We're so abundant in solar on sunny days that you can just as easily charge from your neighbor's solar or the suburb down the road. The price is going to zero and negative increasingly frequently. Some retailers are now offering those prices down to customers, so customers can really take advantage and start to charge their batteries, charge their EVs in those 2 periods, even if they don't have solar. So this is really an opportunity, I think, for all customers that have some way of installing these bidirectional chargers, whether or not they have solar. The challenge is perhaps the customers who don't have off-street parking and can't install these things themselves, maybe because they're renters or apartment dwellers. And that's where the AC V2G opportunity we really do need to support, probably with some trials, but we do need to see that developed. And we can hopefully learn from some of the trials in Europe and the US about that AC V2 grid, because that will enable probably the public charging infrastructure to also support bidirectional charging, open up the option to more customers.
It's not just in the context of Australia, also just if someone has a farmhouse there and have a solar at home, you might just say, I don't want to keep it as an off-grid. I go there and connect my whole house to the car and do whatever we want. There could be all sorts of circumstances the customers will benefit having been able to connect the other appliances to the car, no? And then if everybody starts doing that, then there is a lot of policy ramifications, right? We have a stranded asset risk, this risk and that risk, which Anthony is an expert of. Anthony and I, we worked in the same building during Victorian privatization. So Anthony has a long history of policy issues. Anthony, what are the policy issues that are coming up at a sort of very macro level? And then Dave as well.
Probably a few that the first one that springs to mind when we talk about EVs is the fact that AEMO is forecasting 10 million on the road in 25 years by 2050. Rightly or wrongly, but let's take that one as somewhat indicative of where we're going. If that's the case, then the capacity both in megawatt hours and megawatts that is available potentially from those batteries, if they are connected to the grid in some format, even if only a small percentage are connected, is enormous. Because we've spoken about the low duration curve that exists on our grid and every grid in the world. The Australian one, particularly in some of the southern states, is very peaky. 20% of the capacity of that grid, of all the generation, of all the transmission, of all the distribution is only used for up to 20, 30, even potentially up to 80 hours a year. So the capacity we're talking about, if we could only even harness 10 to 20% of those 10 million EVs, we would have the potential to avoid all of that capacity build. And that's in itself represents tens of billions of dollars of opportunity for assets that are in theory going to be sitting there and going to be available if we just provide the incentives to connect them. So I think that's the absolute primary one that's of real interest to me in making sure this thing works. I think the stranded assets that you mentioned, they solve that problem, I think. I don't think we'll see stranded assets to the extent that we would have in the absence of EVs, so that consumers, as you mentioned, at the fringe of the grid, I'm sure Peter's got some of them in a lot of them in EQ up there, who are costing even just the distributor $10,000 a year just to be serviced. They actually then become more valuable if you can have a EV at the end of the line that is somewhat supporting the grid. Yet determine anywhere near the level of infrastructure, communications, protocols, etc., that would support that. But there's an asset there that can provide that service if we develop the system to use it. So I think grid defection becomes actually a little bit less with EVs if we can show the value, if we can share that value that the EVs can generate back into the grid.
Oh, excellent. I like the number that you mentioned, 10 million EVs, and if 20% of them have bidirectional capacity, that can delay 10% of the investment, just taking account of the low duration curve that is. Anyone opposes those sort of numbers, or anyone has any views on those?
Yes.
Dave, you want to expand? Okay, Ross, go ahead.
I might just throw to Ricardo first. He was waving his hands around before. Ricardo, if you want to jump on the house food.
Yeah, I think they're nice forums to have, but they risk oversimplifying to hand waving and height. So Sahil, you mentioned at one stage run a farm on V2G. That's a good preface into the counterfactuals, because that comes up in a lot of vehicle OEMs' potential use cases for the Australian markets. It's usually the one that sets their warranty and risk people's hair on fire. The fact that just because a car or a product should be able to do a thing functionally is not necessarily a thing that the company would be able to support from a corporate risk perspective. So it ties into 2 points. What are the advantages of V2G and what is V2G? What is V2G from a standards perspective? Functionally is well understood. What it is from an in-market perspective, it's a very unregulated capacity. It does not need to be the same thing as the standard definition. So you can have V2G at 0.5 kilowatt, which is not going to do much for anyone. You can have V2G out of a car at 7 kilowatts, which is going to do a great deal. You can have it at 7 kilowatts for a megawatt hour a year, which is going to peter out with most family homes. You could have it for 10 under warranty in addition to the same amount of, or an unregulated amount of flux within a vehicle warranty over the course of life. There are many definitions, or there's much color to the definition of what V2G is needed. Other standards of control are open, interoperable, independently certified. To what degree a customer can put their hands on the fire and say, I've got into a reliable definition of V2G with this vehicle. We don't have that.
No, but I think let's just stay away from that technical detail, but I'm saying conceptual.
That's the very point I'm making. If you want to have serious forums with serious people, you've got to talk about serious market implications. Because you don't have that definition, it means we haven't answered as a community the other question, which is what is the actual advantage of it? I come from the automotive industry originally. In the auto industry, if something doesn't stack up for more than 50% of the markets that a product is intended to be exported to, it's not developed. When you go as an Australian over to a charging test forum, people work out that you're actually Australian. The vehicle charging proponents light up, they're like, you must know about V2G because you've got a highly dynamic and very volatile market and all the solar and the rest of it. Can you tell us what it's worth? And we are a very small market globally for automakers. So in terms of what is the benefit, globally, very low. Australia, great, but that means that we are a small market. Unless we take structural steps to make ourselves a lot bigger than our projections, then the value is undefined. What does V2G need to be to create any value? We haven't taken any definitive steps as a market. So the notion that the ISP might say there are 10 million cars coming doesn't play anything into how accessible those 10 million cars are going to be. What are the access costs and requirements of those 10 million cars? What value can they actually get? Concepts are nice, and you can get an audience of 100 people together from industry that'll tell you she's going to save the world. It's amazing. But what cost, for what revenue, that entrains what markets, that gets the vendors proposing it, that gets people supporting it, that gets organizations to back it, that creates something that the consumers would buy. We're a long way away from any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Thank you for making that point. Ross, you wanted to say something also?
I was going to pick up on what Anthony was talking about on low duration curves. With respect to what Ricardo said, agree. There's an awful lot of work for us to do to work out exactly how this is going to play out in this market, how it's going to work, how it's going to scale, how those risks to battery warranty on the part of the automakers are handled. Do consumers even want to participate in this future? And what degree of control are consumers going to be willing to hand over? Because we may find that actually consumers don't want to hand over control. And this is something that we are going to collectively discover. But in terms of that potential value stream, there is a network regulated asset base, so the poles and wires from transmission and distribution that are worth only the order of $100 billion in Australia. The extent, yeah, there you go, Anthony, with that more, yeah, but on that order, right? 200 billion, it's somewhere around, it's a number that starts with a one. But it's a very large dollar value of asset base to the extent that EV charging off peak can reduce the degree to which we need to build out that asset base. That'll be a good thing. To the extent that V2G can occur during the peaks, it can take off some of the edge of the need to augment that base further. So there is a benefit there in low duration curve, but there is also a huge benefit in the generation mix. Right now, gas, the price setting part of our generation mix, it doesn't produce an incredibly large amount of the energy, but when it comes on at those times that we need it, it has an inordinate impact on the price. V2G at scale has the potential to bump off some of that marginal generation and thereby take some price out of the wholesale market. Now, I'm not an energy market modeler. That's closer to Dave's bailiwick because I understand it than mine. But that's the two streams there. One is what can V2G do to the wholesale market? And two, what can V2G do to the requirements around network augmentation?
Okay, now Dave hasn't said anything, so he's listening. Now, he has a lot of points. Dave, to you. Thank you, Ross.
Yeah, they've been very good points. And I'll leave Ricardo well alone because I know nothing about standards and chemicals and all the rest. I am that conceptual guy that he's intuitive of. But yeah, look, there's three main benefits. We've covered one is the on the network side. If you can get those, you used to play nice with the network and discharge at the time needed to discharge. And if they charge at the time they can discharge, then you can certainly save an awful lot of money on the network. There's no switch between cup and lip. You could say the same thing about air conditioners. If we just switched off air conditioners a few hours a year, we'd probably save billions as well. But no one ever does that because we've never set up the incentives for anyone to do that. So there's a lot of work to do there. On the wholesale market, I think the easiest thing to say is we aren't going to need a huge amount of batteries. And we're not unusual in that respect. To answer Ricardo's point, every market, every grid around the world, as it decarbonizes, is going to need a huge amount of batteries. And those batteries can be big batteries out in paddocks connected to the main grid. They could be special kitty little home batteries, your Tesla Powerwall stuck on your wall, or they could be EV batteries. And they're basically substitutable. 1 kilowatt hour battery can provide the same service to the grid wherever it is in terms of the generation side. So when you say, what is the value of a V2G? I can look at what is the value of a big battery. It's about $500 a kilowatt hour. Okay, that's what it costs to build a big battery. So that's basically what the market is going to value it at. Put that on your 60 kilowatt hour EV battery, multiply by 500, that's $30,000 that's worth in the market straight away. If you can get it to behave in the same way as a big battery, which of course you can't because you want to drive it as well, but even divide that by 2 or divide that by 5, that's a lot of money. And I would say the third area has nothing to do with the grid at all. It's this V2H we're skirting around, which is when the grid goes down, how do you keep your lights on and your heater on? And you've got a big battery sitting in your garage. Of course, you want to be able to use it when the grid's down, especially those in regional areas. We're subject to floods and storms and all sorts. Everyone in regional areas has been having their power for 12 hours, 24 hours at a time. And just to have that EV in the garage to be able to supply you is great. Now, yes, that doesn't require exactly the same kit as the V2G, but given those 3 benefits, is it worth buying the kit to capture all those 3 benefits? And I think it's definitely going to be. And I understand that there's a lot of steps to go through, but I think this is the case not just for Australia, but all around the world. These benefits will emerge.
But why not just do it with batteries, right? We've got this giant battery subsidy coming through. Seems much simpler than all this stuff Ricardo's telling us about. But why should we bother with people's vehicles that they bought to drive?
So I like to say batteries free on an EV, and people say it's not free because you have to buy an EV. But I say if you go down and buy a petrol vehicle instead, and they tell you, oh, by the way, you get 4 free Powerwalls in the boot, you can stick up in your home, that will definitely be free, right? And that's what you get with an EV. You're getting 4 or 5 Powerwalls effectively in your boot, and you can connect them in. You don't even need to install it to connect them in. You just need to have this clever box on the wall and plug into that. That's the difference, Peter, that it's free. If it was a question of, do I have a 50 kilowatt hour battery in my car or 50 kilowatt hour battery in my garage, and it costs the same, who cares? But yeah, it's a free battery that comes with your car, which is very nice to have. And you've got a choice. That battery's sitting doing nothing 95% of the time, or you can put it to work to earn money for you.
Yeah, I think before we go to Ross, I'll just answer, Peter, the question that you raised, that why not big batteries? Every house has a kitchen. How many people cook in their kitchen now? Just you still want to have a kitchen. So I think we build up redundancies in our life by design. And if it's easy, like you go walk into a restaurant now saying, who has got a spare battery on your bag, or people will just give you, because people carry. We like to have redundancies. I think people will build batteries, and this room is a very bad example. We are all very early adopters. So anyway, Ross, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, in respect to Peter's question, which I suspect might have been a bit of a Dorothy Dixon, right? I know Pete's dead keen on this technology. The reason that I want to be able to take advantage for the battery in my car to do more than just the transport task is that I want to have my cake and eat it too, because that is what cake is for, right? I want to be able to take the advantage of my asset if I can. Now, not everybody will want to take advantage of that asset in that way. Some people don't think about DER or CER. They're thinking the vehicle's a CAR. It's a car. That's what I bought, right? So vehicle degree is not going to be for everybody. But for those folks who want to do it, why not enable it?
But if you have a power failure and your neighborhood people say, oh, this is the only guy who has got a lights on. Hey, what's going on? I've connected my house. So next in line, they will do the same too. A lot of human beings are really not rational beings.
That's not V2G. That's V2L. You don't need V2G for that. All right. So this is why definitions, and I know I sound technical and nitpicky, but it's actually really important because the tech definitions come off the back of applications which are user tested. It's not a pack of nerds making ideas. It's a bunch of people studying markets and then building the application and the underlying frameworks backwards. Well, I agree with Ross and Dave. The ISP takes a very long bet on DER and CER to contain the marginal cost of generation or service provision. And accordingly, that drives the cost of energy in the market more precipitously than anything else. There is an incumbent need to get orchestration, availability correct and orchestration correct. Not a problem. I'd add that all grids will also need ancillary, particularly chrono frequency ancillary services, which are becoming increasingly good at delivering and so on and so forth. Does it make sense economically? There's a small floor in your everyone has kitchens argument. It's the cost of an MG4 is about half the cost of 6 Powerwalls or 4 Powerwalls, which it seems to provide regardless, which is fantastic. And that will only get better because the capital costs are a small portion of variable costs on storage. We can all do basic economics. It's not the capital costs for grid interactivity. It's the enablement cost, which is a different thing. So running a house at the moment for most services to get a battery to dance at home, the rest of it runs between $150 to $200 a year wholesale. Costs that, whether you're doing a battery that's bolted to the wall or the floor, or a car that's on wheels and might not be available the same amount of time, which immediately means, and again, basic mathematics here, that the return on the car is less for the same cost, which we can now skip all the technical shit, go straight to consumer interest. If the returns are less for consumers, it doesn't matter what the battery costs. It means that engagement, unless mandated in market, is going to be implicitly lower unless the enablement costs come down. So it's not a matter of looking at the cars and saying, everyone has kitchens. It's the effort to cook, all right? To use your paradigm or to extend the paradigm. At the moment, what we have in market for services enablement for DER does not make sense for V2G. We had this in our last podcast. There are two vendors, I will not name them in market, but there are two vendors that were heated on cost to make V2G viable. And they're both actively looking at the problem. We have many discussions in Australia as to how we contain that cost. Is it better for DNSPs, Peter's line of work, to extend the DSO paradigm to LP terms and end up in a situation where the DNSP effectively democratizes the cost of controlling your asset, which may include your cars, and that aggregators then become a sort of a front for retailing as much. But if you don't get the enablement costs down, it doesn't matter how cheap a car is.
And I agree to that. But I think the point that Anthony mentioned, that if at the very macro level, if that benefits are there, the wholesale electricity market rule was designed based on a system marginal price that the last generator sets the price. Someone can rethink that, saying, is it relevant now? Is it relevant? All of this can be
run the math on what it costs to make the car dance in a grid orchestrated way. Run the cost and then run it against what it could actually get in market. There's already market uptake data for the rate of, say, VPP or merchant value enablement in the retail market. So the data for what does it take a customer to move voluntarily and avail that asset to merchant opportunities, that data exists. And it's not been 100% of the market. The vast majority of people with batteries in their home don't orchestrate them, aren't interested in sharing them. And what you're suggesting is, oh yeah, but all this stuff, there'll be more of it. And what I'm saying is, but the value is less than what we already know is not good enough for the majority of people. And unless we fix that problem, the value transfer problem, then you don't have access. Some other markets do it very differently, but there are markets across Asia that will strategically mandate vehicle grid interaction as a condition of connection. Right? So
that can be done. What I'm saying, if the value proposition there, society, rules can be changed. Today's rule cannot dictate.
If, Sahel, I'm saying this data already exists. You'd have to structurally change the market.
It will take a while, but the rules do change.
This is an argument for standardization, right? We need interoperable standards that now allow customers to easily plug and play these devices into the markets. And I realize there's complexity there, but standardization can be really simple. And I think we're starting to see those standards emerging in Australia. POS is the standard we've got between the utility and the site. There's a bit of a gap at the moment in the behind the meter interoperability from that gateway, that home energy management system, down to the V2G charger, the battery. But I think we're looking to fill that very quickly as part of the CER roadmap that government's developed and released. To me, those are the things we can talk to behind the scenes. I think the people watching this want to know, why should I participate? And Ricardo pointed to the AEMO's ISP. We assume huge levels of participation. Why are these customers going to want to do this. I think there's an important distinction that needs to be made when we're talking about participation. Participation is allowing coordination of these devices, and that doesn't automatically imply giving up control. I think coordination isn't automatically giving up control. We see some customers taking control of their assets, doing so, participating, making a lot of money, doing that in a way that fits within their comfort zone and their preferences. I guess I put it out to some of the people who haven't spoken for a little while, how we can get customers.
Yeah. Ross, you wanted to say something, or it's your hand up from before?
Yeah, no, hands up new. We agree with the question of the value transfer problem. If we not ensure that the value created ends up largely in the hands of the person who has the vehicle and is choosing to modify their behavior for the common benefit, then of course they'll not participate. If the value gets captured at the DNSP level, if the value gets captured at the retail level, then the consumer will be left with very little reason to participate and will choose not to. So that implies requirements around network tariff reform. It implies requirements around, in the retail market, either the existence of competition, or in those areas where there isn't competition, government involvement to ensure that retail tariffs that will reward the outcomes we want exists. There's work to do there. In terms of the willingness to participate, Dave raised the question of air conditioning a little while ago. In Queensland, Peaks Territory, the Peak Smart program has been around for a long time, has somewhere close to 200,000 air conditioning units that are subject to an external control signal. That's an opt-in program, right? It's not mandated. If a consumer wants to participate, they can sign up for it. There is a reward at the time of the installation of the air conditioner. And then in times of need, there is flexibility, right? Now, that scheme doesn't attract the majority of air conditioning users because most people installing an air conditioner bought it because they want to use it on a hot summer afternoon. They don't want to hand over that control. But there are some that will. And this is the question: what percentage of people want to engage in what way, and what form or type of reward do they need in order to be able to participate? I might just really quickly, while I've got the speaking stick, touch on that question of what happens when the power goes out. That vehicle load piece. There was a piece of news coverage from Queensland, a year and a half ago, someone using, I think it was a BYD, to power their child's dialysis machine during a power outage. Right. Now, that's not V2G. That's vehicle to load proxying as a vehicle to home because they plugged an appliance into the car and ran the appliance when they needed it. That's not a use case that's going to be particularly typical in the cities. I live in Moonee Ponds in Melbourne. It's been a long time since I've had a power outage here. The network is reliable, but there are parts of the network, there are parts of the country where power outages are routine. And these people, even if they're not worried about dialysis machines, are going to be worried about the fridge and the freezer. I'll stop talking there.
Pick up on that, Sahel?
Yeah. Sure. Go ahead, Anthony.
Just sticking sort of a policymaker hat on for a minute. We've talked about the opportunity. There's an opportunity value. There are batteries in these vehicles. And let's not talk about the consumer cost to get access to the markets, both network and generation at this point. And there's a real consumer benefit in terms of capital reductions, future capital reductions, both at the grid and the generation side. As we've seen in solar, the grid probably doesn't stay stable when we have EVs en masse that are VPP connected or at least exposed to pricing, in such that when we're at 36 gigawatts system peak today, is switching on and off due to storm event notifications or something else is outside the system's ability to cope at this present time. So we'll probably need to see something like CSIP Oz, the solar management, flipped onto the EV side as well in the future, so that we can have a grid that's right size, not built for any contingency. And so if we go down that pathway of establishing the protocols and systems that will support dynamic operating envelopes in both directions, import and export, so solar exports and dynamic imports, we are creating half of the communications pathways and standards that are needed. Again, policymakers will be stepping back, looking at the values, sunk cost of the vehicles, the opportunity of the grid and wholesale markets, and working out if the market doesn't step up to deliver them, then there'll need to be an intervention and supporting what Ricardo was saying, an intervention that includes incentives or requirements, obligations on consumers. So ideally, we want the market to come in here and the AMBER model to be reciprocate and flow through to all consumers in a way that gives them sufficient value to participate in these markets. But if that doesn't happen, I wouldn't rule out the fact that all consumers are better off if these assets are used to the betterment of all consumers, and we find a general societal need that requires standardization to that effect.
Yep. Okay. Ricardo, you want to make any comments on that?
Look, there are ways through this, and I think we have a split discussion here, which is deeply conceptual with regards to the possibility, and that's actually been played out historically for over 30 years now. So the very first demonstrations of V2G were actually located. It wasn't a vehicle to home, vehicle to load type. It was actually what we would refer to as regulation FCAS in Australia. So the notion cars can do more is not a new thing. We're in a very interesting place, particularly in the Australian market, where the need is accelerated relative to the rest of the world. We have a bunch of incumbent standards that enable OCPP to Australians, neither of which were working for Australian firms at the time. Got a whole bunch into OCPP 2.1. There's actually a functional block for DER integration, which does the vast majority of what we're talking to. It's deeply compatible with 2035 requirements. We don't take it in Australia, and because standards for those that have been involved take a while to make, a lot of the thinking is old. So I'll give you a great example. When we talk consumers, we talk about things consumers can buy. When we talk about societal benefit, we talk about packages. Between the two, there is currently in standards no way for a vehicle to communicate to a third party, a standardized way, where it sits with respect to its warranty conditions for V2G use, which basically means all you're talking to are effectively sent in manufacturer or vehicle OEM limited channels. And that's really not a good outcome for Australia, because it goes back to what I said earlier, we're a very small market. There are firms, auto firms, that are starting their own energy businesses. They see the linkages, they see diminishing services revenues because EVs have got less to fix and they're implicitly more reliable. They say we could start up an energy company, we could wangle that into supplying people's homes and everything's beautiful, great services, agree with the sky. They look at Australia and they go, that's a lot of work for a really small market. And accordingly, we have a need to focus discussion, focus policy effort on, first of all, understanding what we can do as a nation. Secondly, about understanding what we can use and leverage. And thirdly, closing that gap between people and product. That's where the problem is. Everything we've talked about to date, otherwise, has been prosecuted in many forums for many years internationally. There is literally nothing new under the sun. What we need to be talking about is the gaps that are relevant to Australia to closing that gap between people and the products and services that are making these possibilities. Cost is one, access is another, data flow is a third, cybersecurity a fourth. But if we don't focus our efforts on that, it will remain an interesting study, and battery subsidies will rule the world.
Why do you see Australia as unique? California is moving ahead with V2G, isn't it? Other markets like Texas have huge battery growth, demand for batteries, very volatile market. Why do you see Australia as unique? And the OEM saying, oh, it's just Australia, why would we bother?
The uniquity is how far ahead we are with the energy transition. So California is substantially work, Texas, even Maryland, which announced their interconnection guidelines for V2G a couple of days ago, started after us. But their efforts were cohesive. One of the main reasons why, Dave, I believe, is the impetus for driving the acceleration of missing glue, whether it's standards, functionality, the rest of it doesn't exist. In most markets, vehicle OEMs present in a technical capacity. They say, we built the high-value product, the car, that can do all this stuff. And we are going to get involved and engaged in the market in ways that proliferate this stuff in a very long-term strategy. We used to do that in Australia till about circa 2011, when the auto industry decided it was going to leave, and certainly not after 2014, we did leave. So there is a very major knowledge gap there, certainly very well intended. When you are directly connected to head office as an engineering concern, saying we are here functionally, in 20 years, we invest in making the market conditions suitable to there. That is a very different thing to a farmer wants to run their vineyard / agritourism business off their 20 kilowatt hour Renault Clio because functionally they can do it. What you get in Australia at the other end is a sales agent that is deeply concerned with the risk abatement of the warranties they would need to hold up. And the easiest answer is no. Nor do they have the resources within their own staff in Australia to present yes.
Yeah, I get that. But why aren't the Chinese headquarters saying, geez, V2G is going to be huge in 10 years' time. We need to work, or 5 years, we need to work towards them. And maybe Australia's a good case study. Maybe we can work with them to advance our understanding. But you're right, they're not going to build a car just for Australia, obviously. But why do you think this is not going to be worldwide? And why do you think OEMs don't see that and see that it's going to be worldwide and prepare accordingly?
No, OEMs certainly do. And I'm a massive proponent of V2G. I work in a range of forums internationally, have a consultancy that deals with this almost exclusively. The prevailing view of the market to generate the standards that we inherit are that it is 7 to 8 years away in terms of a mass market adoption thing. So when we come along and we say, but in Australia, if everything else was set up, we'd be in market yesterday. Because we have the volatility, we have the willing customers, we have the value transfer arguments. You can value transfer with BPP. We've had those rules for over a decade. You can go to Amber and have ultimate agency yourself if you want. A bunch of amp, low power. If you don't want to be a small amp, you can get big amber. We can do all that sort of stuff. But when you come back to Standards Australia then and say, so where's the adoption of the standards that define what we need to do so we can call out V2G? And the Department of Transport can point to those standards as a homologation requirement or not. So that the cars that come to market have to have that. And the charging stations that need to support that sort of stuff, that's all bereft. That's where we're completely unique, right? So we're so unique that when the UK passed its smart charging requirements for UK charging stations, we literally got dumped with a bunch of product that you couldn't sell in the UK anymore. We get dump charges at exceptional prices. We will also get very large charges at market. And yes, we have many vendors trying to do the right thing now. But accordingly, we have a very significant and unregulated disparity of getting the product space ready. The product space being ready creates confidence both for OEMs that would bring products to market and for the consumers that would buy them. And until we solve that, it's a pipe dream. And we need to solve that. There are people that are working on it, but I think it goes without saying that we are behind relative to market norms, despite our market being vastly ahead in terms of what demand it could satiate.
It is funny that we are so leading the world in solar and the response to the oversupply of solar. And yet we are lagging on the EV side of things. And where intrinsically you can see the linkages between the two. So I'm not disagreeing, Ricardo, in the least. I'm just saying it's quite an interesting juxtaposition. And I wonder if there's a way in which we can accelerate the latter using the former.
Yeah. Okay, Ross.
I'll make an observation. If you consider V2G to be a marathon, this is going to be a little bit of an analogy, maybe not entirely accurate, but by virtue of where we've started with solar and the structure of our markets, we have the opportunity to start at the 15-kilometer mark. Where we seem to be struggling is putting on our boots and starting running. Others that started further behind than us are in fact running this race, and we are not running it perhaps as hard as we could. My observation around the sorts of things that might cause it to accelerate in Australia, we have a very large number of homes with relatively small solar systems on them. People are going over time to be looking at those solar systems and upgrading them. There have been products in other markets available that will do the combination of solar panel, conversion of DC to AC for grid synchronization, and vehicle to grid, extract the DC out of the car, turn it into grid synchronized AC. I see a future coming relatively soon where one of the plays from solar installation companies will be, let's upgrade your solar system from 2 kilowatts to 5. I'll remove that old system for you, potentially sell it offshore to some other country that's willing to accept a second-hand solar system. And by the way, the new inverter that I'm putting on the wall will perform the purpose of V2G with these vehicles with whom we have tested it. That kind of enablement, that kind of marketplace structure, I believe we'll see that because there are products around that can do that. It's just a question of how long it's going to take for that sort of approach to start becoming more mainstream and less the sort of thing that people on this call might do on a spare weekend in their own house. I'll stop there.
Any views on that? I think where we are getting at, yes, we have a lot of technical challenges, but I like the point that Ross made. Australia's started the solar race so late, and then now we have 1.6 kilowatt per householders per capita, right? It just moves so fast. So once the people get their runners on, things might move. So in terms of V2G, what do you see happening by 2030? I think there is the roadmap, right? V2G roadmap for quite a number of roadmaps that I have read, especially for Australia.
Yeah, I think we've got multiple roadmaps. We need a Melways for the road, or whatever the equivalent is. It's a roadmap.
Yeah, the Melways. I forgot about that. Melways.
Yeah. Another interesting aspect is, so if we followed what we've seen in PVs through, if the networks were to become overly concerned about the connection of EVs, level 2 charging EVs in the home and connection rates, there's a potential there that they might start seeking to limit them, and might see what, if we were to see what we're seeing in solar, you can have a 1.5 kilowatt connection, or you can have a 10 kilowatt connection, but you can only have the 10 kilowatt if you agree to be on the CCPOs. So on the dynamic controls. I believe by 2030, we're probably going to be in a space where we're starting to see networks responding to the need. Combined with this will also be offers to customers to upgrade the grid, but the upgrade the grid option always starts at $10,000 and escalates towards $100 very quickly. So individual consumers won't be very interested in that model, I suspect. So the option of, do you want 1.5 charging or 10 kilowatt charging, I think that will dynamically start to change the field a little bit. And if we see customer adoption at the 10 kilowatt level, then we're starting to see connectivity creeping up the value chain. It's not all the way that we've been talking about so far, but it's heading in that direction. So again, I think that'll be one of the drivers that we see emerge over the next 5 years that you're asking about this.
Okay.
I think that's a great direction. And I'll say something that is controversial with respect to my ongoing friendship with Ross, so I might duck under the table, lest the screen explodes after this. But I think the networks banded together under a common voice and putting arguments around what may or may not go in the rabbit side have a very significant part to play on this. Look, we have some things to solve that are independent of the networks. Like we need to up our homologation standards for vehicles pretty acutely. I'm involved in some projects that try and look at that. Whether they'll be successful or not is TBD. But in terms of what networks have the power to say, either this way or that way, it goes on the network, and they have the resources to say, and we'll provide a base level of services that improves the investment efficiency of the operation of the network. So I'll give you two sharp examples. One's obvious, one's not so much. We have the DSO, which was formed of the deep. It was never regulated into live. So where the network's obligations stop, is it a digital signboard that says, please give us this much in this location? Or is it all the way to edge control, as we're now doing for emergency backstop and whatnot? But if that monopoly were extended to provide a base level of communications to individual vehicle charging stations, and if it was done correctly, open protocols, proper interoperability, as much commercial off-the-shelf stuff as possible, not call GM and spend $15 million of taxpayer money times 14 individual DNSPs. If it was done, it could end up very efficient and affect very much of what needs to be done from the orchestration side of things. It could also create market outcomes for customers that wanted to opt into that. But most importantly, it could do it at a very low cost, right? Or at an otherwise socialized cost, depending how the RAV was bought into things. And networks can set that as a connection requirement in lieu of needing DQ to deal with it. I'm not criticizing the department or the agency. DQ has a remit that is literally wider than the sea and deeper than the ocean. Dealing with everything in an acute and direct manner is a very hard ask. The other thing networks can do is to drive cybersecurity. Now, give you an example. Networks want to run public charging at the moment, so there's been a proposal that they should own vehicle roaming. What's that got to do with V2G? Modern vehicle roaming requires a PKI ecosystem for the combined charging systems communication standard, ISO 15118, to be in place. What most people don't understand is that if you do the standard V2G and you don't have the PKI in place by the standard, you cannot discharge. Now, you can imagine if this went through the series of government agencies that would need to be involved, and the governance that needed to be created, and the AEMC rule change that would need to be prosecuted, or would not be guaranteed by way of outcome, and we could be boiling the ocean forever. But the networks have it within their potential to cut a lot of that red tape and say, look, if you want to get on board, we need to maintain the network's integrity. And to do that, we need cyber that is leading, compelling, and the rest of it. We've done it partially for roaming because we don't want to be seen to be creating walled gardens or to be limiting consumer amenity or so on and so forth. But it worked just as well for V2G, and we've solved that problem. I know a lot of this stuff can sound like we are moving away from competitive markets, which are an intent of the NEOs, without question. But I think if Australia can have that very hard discussion around the networks that can break the state-based individual interpretation of rules and make Australia look like one market, not set in a bunch of smaller markets, they can create minimum performance requirements which are basically make it easier for V2G to come to market, but make Australia look like a grown-up market for the rest of the world. Change could come along very quickly. That would be a good use of the network's potential. Ross, do I need to duck under and Peter remind me of Krypton's card list? How do we sit with this?
You're right, Ricardo. No grenades. Obviously, you and I have some divergences of view on what would constitute good in some respects, right? First thing I'd pick up on, though, is that the vast majority of energy delivery into the cars, right? So not talking about V2G, just charging the cars, is going to be happening in people's homes. To the extent that various folks, networks, aggregators, retailers want to arrange control over that charging, they're going to need to present the consumer with something that is attractive to the consumer. Because if it's not, the consumer will simply take their Mode 2 charger, plug it into a 10 amp power point, and charge the car whensoever they please. It's highly unlikely that option is going to be taken away from them for the same sorts of reasons that consumers today still have access to flat tariffs. While a perfectly arranged system would include you hand over control to some agency to manage it, that's not something that's within the Overton window. So I think we need to accept as a community what's going to happen is if we want orchestration on the charging, that needs to be done on the basis of what are the consumers willing to accept. In terms of orchestration of the export, so we're now reaching a point where after 20 years of solar, time is being called on, you can export as much as you want whenever you want. No, actually, we do need to control some of that stuff in order to keep the lights on for everybody. It will be a good long while before that is necessary for V2G, but the end point is if we want to use V2G to do things like back down gas-fired power stations, cancel coal-fired power stations, we will need all those same sorts of levels of security that come with let's run the system in an organized way. I think the big point of difference that I'd have with respect to how much of that is necessary right now is in these early stages of V2G, there's probably a bit more room for experimentation. You try things out, see what works, with the red line being you're not allowed to electrocute someone or burn a house down, rather than that you're not allowed to have something that is perhaps a little less secure than we might want in 5 or 10 years' time. One other point that I'd make around the 23rd question that Sahel asked, in 2006, we had about 1,100 solar installations done in this country. 5 years later, in 2011, we had about 360,000 installations done. So close on a 350-fold increase in activity. That didn't happen because of the fundamental change in technology. It happened because of the fundamental change in government support. That was when we started doing things like SREDs. It's when we started doing things like 60 cents per kilowatt hour solar feed-in tariff. How much V2G we will have in 2030 will be largely governed by, do we remove the roadblocks so people can do it? And that's the work that's happening right now. It's becoming a thing that you can legally do. And then how much government support does it get? Because if we want 2030 to be vehicle to grid's 2011 solar year, then the thing to do is to unblock a whole lot of government support, subsidize, rebate, structure it, however you wish, right? The existing SRES arrangement extended into home batteries could be done that way, could be done as a rebate, could be done as PDRS in New South Wales, lots of ways it could be sliced. But some support to prime the pump and kickstart it is how you would get an accelerated V2G outcome. In the absence of that, you will find the keenest early adopting bleeding edge consumers doing it anyway, but they won't be enough to get you to millions in the short order.
Let's pick up on that government support, because something I was going to say is one thing we have seen in the last few months, really, a year, is governments turning their mind to home batteries. Now, I'm not a big fan of home batteries. I think they're a bit of a waste of money at the moment, but they are throwing money at them at the moment, and I think that could change things. Obviously, an EV battery is just a big home battery in some ways. If consumers get used to the idea they got this home battery, they're obviously pushing VPPs as well. So consumers will have, or retailers would have to work out, how do we get customers to play ball? How do we make value propositions that make sense for them? But if in a few years we do have hundreds of thousands of home batteries operating with VPPs in some way and making a lot of money, I think that's an immediate translation into V2Gs. Of course, other stuff has to happen. But if you've got a 10 kilowatt battery at home and it's earning you thousands of dollars a year, and you've got an EV sitting in the garage, you think that's 6 times bigger. How much money could I make if I could do the same thing with my V2G? So it's a bit of a stepping stone potentially towards that sort of V2G idea.
Yeah. Behaviorally and financially, isn't it, Dave?
People say customers are not interested. Everyone's interested when they see dollars, right? Everybody is interested. Everyone says solar will cook off because everyone's so worried about the planet. Solar took off because it was the no-brainer. You get your money back in 3 years, and they saw their neighbors getting their money back, and they say, I'm in. It's all about the money. And if you can make money on a home battery, then you can potentially make money on a V2G. And sure, there's loads of other technical obstacles, but consumers will be beating down the door saying, fix this. And I think everyone will hear that.
Okay, I think we are coming to an very end. Anthony, you wanted to make some comments. Anthony, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm just going to pull Dave's comments there. I think I'm seeing this on a lot of the forums and the communications people on the Amber who are technically interested in connecting their homes and their batteries. They're all aching to get their EV connected into the system because they're seeing how much money they're making on the battery, on the small capacity that sits in the battery. So yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Anyway, I think Ross also has to go. Any other last minute comments? I know this is a big topic. We could need few hours, but we only set up at 1 hour. Any other comments anyone wants to make before we close? Maybe last minute from everyone.
I'd say that Peter's face was wonderfully inscrutable when I was talking about what the networks could do. Congratulations, Peter. You didn't flinch.
Yeah, root canal.
The drugs help. When we talk about what could happen in 5 or 10 years, DNSP do their resets in 5 or 10 year horizons. So don't be surprised to see that stuff coming up now strategically. Asking for investment on things that will do it again, yes. The correct facial expression, simple there, Anthony, correct. I think the discussion risks conflating customers with enthusiasts. We talk about Amber, for example. I love Amber. I think they're great. I think they're fantastic. I'd go with Amber. I'm an engineer. I'm not a real customer. I would bet that Amber has under 10,000 customers on Smart Shift, and I would know that there are 10 million households in Australia. The arguments we proliferate, and those 10,000 customers are the ones that are with Amber or the early version of Reposit or God knows what orchestrator that does many things and are willing to look at their bill and say, oh, V2G generated this, so on and so forth. They've been doing the same shit for the last 10 years. They'll be around for the next 100 years, but they don't grow as a market segment.
It doesn't have to be Amber, though. That's a mistake, I think. At the moment, we got two opposites. We got the Amber, where a customer takes all the risk and gets all the benefit. And then we got the other end where the retailer basically takes all the risk and gets all the benefit. There's got to be places in between. I think there's space for that.
Having pulled apart the DER space and worked in BPPs for a fair while, it's not necessarily that. Most resi customers are deeply concerned with capital costs being understood and minimized or ops costs going down, but they very rarely concern themselves with both. So you have people that are like, my bill's zero, but your solar costs 20 grand. Yeah, but my bill's zero. And you have people that say, it's solar for nothing. So until we come to a space where we can provide adequate certainty and compelling certainty to either of those perspectives of using V2G, this remains a fringe argument. And I do get wary when I hear people saying, oh, what a technical. In Australia, we do this wonderful thing of ring fencing nerds and saying, your shit's over there and we need to talk about big flossy shit. I do this in other markets and they actually have the engineers in the rooms, and in deciding reg and policy, they have subject matter experts, and it's the outcome we want, the outcome we can get, and then how do we make it happen? It's a very fluid and cohesive culturally discussion. And Ross is smiling because he knows a lot of people like me, most of them pissed off overseas to work because they could be more effective accordingly. We have about 5,000 Australians globally that work in EV development to these ends. Most do not work on these shores. So how we train the industry that creates the certainty, has some technical bits, that creates the products that the 10 million homes can get. Not the minority of customers that will always be engaged with the bleeding edge. No one else gives a shit. They want certainty in value. And that's what the tenor of this discussion is. How do we get to certainty and value? I think the networks are bit to pay. I think Ross is correct in subsidy to enable the market. I think we need to get vehicle homologation correct. There is a path where Australia gets back to competitiveness very quickly, but it needs top-down structure to work.
I might just add one quick thing. I know I said that I needed to drop off, and now I'm going to throw one more thing in. That comment at how many customers are doing the complicated thing, right? What proportion of the customer base want the wholesale paths through Amber style product? There's definitely a bunch of customers out there. But if you look at the number of customers that are on plans like the AGL Night Saver plan, right? AGL recently made a submission where they opened up how many customers they have on that. It's a really simple one. It just makes the price really cheap between midnight and 6 a.m. So you can set your car to charge at that time. You can save a few $100 a year. They've got north of 20,000 Australian customers on that specific retail tariff, in amongst their hundreds of thousands of actual customers. That translates to on the order of 10% of the Australians that own an EV are on the AGL Night Saver plan. We're not talking fringe anymore. We're talking about a chunk of the EV owning population that is big enough to move the needle all by itself. And they're not the only retailer with a plan like that. They're just one of the larger ones. So the question there is, we're targeting the consumer as opposed to the enthusiast. The consumer is probably looking for something that is easy to grasp, simple to grasp, that they can just do. Now, whether that looks really simple to the consumer and it's really complicated under the hood with all of the complexity hidden from them, or whether it looks like it is in fact just really simple, you can slice that a couple of different ways. But that's probably a topic for another discussion when we're not 70 minutes into a 1 hour call.
Yeah. Okay. I get some last minute comment from Peter and Anthony and Dave, and then we conclude. Yeah.
I'm going to jump, guys. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ross. Thank you. Peter, you have some last minute comments?
I think we're going to see V2G installed on networks across Australia this year. We've already seen Essential Energy enabling it. Other networks are going to follow rapidly over the next 6 months. Starting now, it's early days. It's happening for those who are really keen.
Okay. Dave?
Yeah, I would just say, to follow on Ricardo's comments, I totally agree. To make something mass market, it has to be simple and it has to be lucrative. It has to be those two things. Solar was that. Solar was so simple and so lucrative. That's where you got to get to. And Amber can get there. Amber's lucrative. It doesn't, it's simple. You just set and forget. That's where it needs to be. And I think that home batteries could get there in the next few years, and that could set us up for V2G in the future.
Okay, Anthony?
Yeah, again, I point to the benefit of the vehicle sitting in the home and the opportunity that provides to all consumers. So we'll either get there by the free market, or we will need policy to drive that. And the other aspect that always concerns me is the need to continue to consider grid stability and price, and separate from the pricing. We need a stable grid irrespective of what the pricing incentives say. So incentive models are never perfect. We'll need backup systems to ensure the grid stays stable the whole time, and they have to be preeminent. And even if we use them less than 0.1% of the time, we'll still need those protections in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Ricardo, any last minute comments?
Well, it can go another 3 hours.
No. What? 1 minute.
I'd love for people to view this, come up with a bunch of questions and comments, and for this to become a regular thing. I think what V2G needs, beyond question, is a top-down policy. I would say the charging segment has not quite entered market failure, but in general has not created compelling outcomes of itself relative to the charging services market in other countries. So yes, top-down policy, not necessarily rationalization of the market, is required. But in terms of what that looks like and the bodies of extant knowledge that can be drawn on, and how relatable and relevant some numbers that we already have are, and so on and so forth, what it actually needs is more discussion. I think forums like this are excellent. I think I'd love to see people respond and say that bloke at the Shake Tear tracksuit was a complete dickhead, and the other people were very erudite and lovely. Or I agree with this, I want to hear more of that. And we should do this more often until more people participate. Like a ripple in a pond sale becomes a much wider, much more informed, much deeper discussion that more people are aware of. And that as a nation, regulators, policymakers, consumers, productizers, the rest of it, we can move faster and more cohesive. That's what we need at the zero level.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for your knowledge. These are complicated subjects. I think, as Ricardo was saying, the more we discuss, different people with different skills in the same room. So I think this sort of discussion often helps. So I hope this was useful for you. I know you have given your time. Thank you again.
Thanks, Hal. And take care, Peter. I hope you're recovering.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for organising, Sahar. It's been fun.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs. If you enjoyed this, don't forget the full video is on YouTube. Just search Energypreneurs. Thank you. See you next time.